In the vast and shadowy corridors of the Soviet Union's intelligence apparatus, there existed secrets so profound that even today, decades after the collapse of the Iron Curtain, they remain shrouded in mystery. Among these closely guarded secrets was a clandestine unit dedicated to investigating one of the most perplexing phenomena of the 20th century, unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. The existence of this unit was a closely held secret, hidden from the public and even from many within the Soviet government itself. It was a secret so well protected that for years it was nothing more than a whispered rumor among conspiracy theorists and a subject of intense speculation among UFO enthusiasts. But as the Soviet Union crumbled and its once impregnable walls of secrecy began to crack, glimpses of this hidden world began to emerge, revealing a story of intrigue, fear, and a desperate race for knowledge that spanned the Cold War era. The Cold War context. To understand the Soviet Union's interest in UFOs, one must first consider the broader context of the Cold War, a period marked by intense rivalry and paranoia between the world's two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not just a geopolitical struggle, it was also a technological and scientific race, with both sides vying for supremacy in fields as diverse as nuclear weapons, space exploration, and intelligence gathering. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union defined much of the 20th century. Both nations sought not only to outpace each other in developing advanced weaponry, but also to establish themselves as the dominant force in the new frontier of space. This race was underpinned by a mutual distrust that permeated every aspect of society, from espionage and propaganda to the secretive development of new technologies. The fear of the unknown was palpable, and anything that fell outside the realm of conventional understanding was viewed with suspicion and often alarm. In this atmosphere of suspicion and competition, reports of unidentified flying objects took on a new significance. The United States had its own UFO phenomena, famously exemplified by the Roswell incident in 1947 and the subsequent establishment of Project Blue Book, an official government investigation into UFO sightings. The Soviets, always wary of being outpaced by their American rivals, could not afford to ignore the possibility that these sightings might represent a new and potentially devastating technological threat. The fear that the United States might have gained access to advanced extraterrestrial technology, or that they were developing secret aircraft far beyond the capabilities of conventional planes, was a terrifying prospect for the Soviet leadership. In this context, it made perfect sense for the Soviet Union to establish its own secret unit dedicated to investigating UFOs. But the existence of such a unit was something that the Soviet government could never openly acknowledge, not only because of the political and military implications, but also because of the potential for public panic. The formation of the secret unit. The exact date when the Soviet UFO investigation unit was formed remains unclear, but it is believed to have been established in the early 1950s, not long after the United States began its own investigations into UFOs. The unit was reportedly part of the KGB, the Soviet Union's feared and omnipresent intelligence agency, which was responsible for both internal security and foreign intelligence. The KGB had a reputation for being ruthless and efficient, and it was the perfect organization to oversee such a sensitive and secretive operation. The unit, known by the codename Blue Curtain, was tasked with investigating all reports of UFO sightings within the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Its mandate was broad and included not only the collection and analysis of sighting reports, but also the investigation of any physical evidence, such as debris from crashed objects, and the interrogation of witnesses. The unit operated under the strictest secrecy, with its activities hidden, even from many within the KGB itself. Members of Blue Curtain were selected for their loyalty to the state, their scientific expertise, and their ability to keep secrets. They were drawn from a variety of fields, including aviation, astrophysics, and military intelligence. Once recruited, they were sworn to absolute secrecy, with the threat of severe consequences should they ever divulge what they knew. This secrecy was not just about protecting state security, it was also about protecting the Soviet Union's image as a rational scientific society. Admitting that the government was investigating UFOs would have been seen as a sign of weakness, an acknowledgement that there were phenomena beyond the control or understanding of Soviet science. The creation of Blue Curtain was a direct response to the perceived threat posed by UFOs, and it represented a significant investment of resources and manpower. The Soviet leadership was determined to leave no stone unturned in its quest to understand the nature of these mysterious objects. The unit was given access to some of the most advanced technology and scientific expertise available, and its members were encouraged to explore every possible avenue of investigation, no matter how unconventional. Early investigations and findings. The early years of Blue Curtain were marked by a flurry of activity as reports of UFO sightings poured in from across the Soviet Union. Many of these sightings came from rural areas where strange lights in the sky and unexplained phenomena had long been part of local folklore. But what made these reports different was the sheer number of them and the consistency of the descriptions provided by witnesses. One of the first major cases investigated by Blue Curtain occurred in 1952 in the remote region of Siberia. A group of geologists working in the area reported seeing a large, metallic object hovering above the treetops. The object, which they described as disc-shaped and emitting a faint hum, remained in the air for several minutes before suddenly accelerating and disappearing at incredible speed. The geologists were not the only witnesses. Several local villagers also reported seeing the object, describing it in almost identical terms. Blue Curtain dispatched a team of investigators to the area who conducted a thorough search of the site. They found no physical evidence of the object, but they did collect detailed testimonies from the witnesses, which were later analyzed by experts in Moscow. The case was classified as unexplained, but it was just the beginning of a series of similar reports that would keep the unit busy for years to come. As the years passed, Blue Curtain's investigations expanded beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. The unit began receiving reports of UFO sightings from Eastern European countries, as well as from Soviet military personnel stationed abroad. One particularly alarming report came from East Germany in 1955, where a group of Soviet soldiers claimed to have seen a cigar-shaped object hovering above their base. The object was reportedly surrounded by a glowing aura and emitted a high-pitched sound that caused the soldiers to feel disoriented and nauseous. Once again, Blue Curtain dispatched a team to investigate, but they found no concrete evidence to explain the sighting. The early investigations conducted by Blue Curtain revealed several patterns that would come to define the unit's work. First, many of the most compelling sightings occurred in remote or isolated areas, far from major population centers. This made it easier for the Soviet government to suppress information about the sightings and to keep the public in the dark. Second, the objects described by witnesses often exhibited characteristics that were far beyond the capabilities of any known human technology, including the ability to hover silently, to accelerate at incredible speeds, and to change direction instantaneously. These characteristics were so consistent across different sightings that some within Blue Curtain began to suspect that the objects might not be of earthly origin. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the sheer volume of reports and the consistency of the descriptions provided by witnesses convinced many within Blue Curtain that something unusual was happening. But what that something was remained a mystery. Were these objects advanced aircraft developed by the United States? Were they a natural phenomenon that science had yet to explain? Or were they, as some within the unit began to suspect, evidence of extraterrestrial visitation? The role of the military. As Blue Curtain's investigations continued, it became increasingly clear that many of the most compelling UFO sightings were occurring near military installations. In some cases, these sightings involved unidentified objects that appeared to be conducting surveillance on Soviet military activities. This was particularly concerning to the Soviet leadership, who feared that the United States might be using advanced technology to spy on their military operations. In response to these concerns, Blue Curtain began working closely with the Soviet military, sharing information and coordinating investigations. The military, for its part, was eager to understand the nature of these objects, particularly if they posed a threat to Soviet security. Reports of UFOs interfering with military exercises, disrupting communications, and even disabling radar systems were taken very seriously, and the military provided Blue Curtain with whatever resources it needed to conduct its investigations. One of the most alarming incidents occurred in 1960 during a routine military exercise in the Ural Mountains. A group of Soviet fighter jets was conducting training maneuvers when they were suddenly approached by a large, disc-shaped object. The object, which was described as being the size of a football field, hovered above the jets, causing their instruments to malfunction. The pilots attempted to engage the object, but it suddenly accelerated and disappeared from sight at an incredible speed. The incident was reported to Blue Curtain, who conducted a full investigation but were unable to determine the origin of the object. This and other similar incidents led some within the Soviet military to suspect that the UFOs were indeed advanced American aircraft, perhaps the result of secret research programs. The Cold War rivalry fueled this suspicion, as the United States was known to be conducting its own secretive research into new aviation technologies, including experimental aircraft that could potentially outmaneuver conventional fighter jets. The Soviet military was deeply concerned about the possibility that the United States had developed a new generation of aircraft capable of penetrating Soviet airspace undetected. However, the more Blue Curtain investigated, the more they began to doubt this theory. The objects described by witnesses and military personnel often exhibited flight characteristics that defied the known laws of physics. For example, some objects were reported to have made right-angle turns at high speeds, something that no known human-made aircraft could achieve without disintegrating from the stress. Others were described as hovering silently in the air with no visible means of propulsion. These characteristics were so far beyond the capabilities of any known technology that some within Blue Curtain began to entertain the possibility that the objects might not be of terrestrial origin. Encounters in space. As the Soviet Union embarked on its ambitious space program in the 1960s, Blue Curtain's work took on a new dimension. Reports of unidentified objects in space began to surface, with some cosmonauts claiming to have seen strange lights and objects during their missions. These reports were treated with the utmost seriousness, as the possibility of encountering unknown objects in space was a matter of both national security and scientific interest. One of the most famous cases involved cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, who reported seeing a glowing object during his ill-fated mission aboard Soyuz 1 in 1967. Komarov described the object as a bright light that appeared to be following his spacecraft. Despite attempts to communicate with ground control, the object remained unexplained. Tragically, Komarov's mission ended in disaster when Soyuz 1's parachute failed to deploy, causing the spacecraft to crash upon re-entry. Komarov's report of the unidentified object was included in the official investigation, but was quickly classified as top secret. Other cosmonauts reported similar experiences, with some describing encounters with objects that seemed to be observing their spacecraft. These reports were highly classified, and only a select few within the Soviet space program and Blue Curtain were aware of them. The possibility that these objects were extraterrestrial in origin raised profound questions about humanity's place in the cosmos and the potential for contact with other civilizations. Blue Curtain worked closely with the Soviet space program to investigate these reports, analyzing data from spacecraft instruments and debriefing cosmonauts upon their return to Earth. However, the investigations were hampered by the limited technology of the time, and many of the reports remained unexplained. The Soviet leadership was deeply concerned about the implications of these encounters, particularly if they represented a potential threat to the Soviet space program. Disinformation and secrecy. As the Soviet Union's UFO investigation unit continued its work, the government became increasingly concerned about the potential for public panic if the existence of the unit or its findings were ever revealed. The fear that news of extraterrestrial visitation could lead to mass hysteria, coupled with the desire to maintain control over the narrative, led the Soviet government to implement a campaign of disinformation and secrecy. This campaign had several key components. First, the state-controlled media was instructed to downplay or ridicule reports of UFO sightings. Articles dismissing sightings as the result of mass hysteria, weather phenomena, or misidentified aircraft became common, and witnesses who came forward with their stories were often publicly discredited. The goal was to create an environment in which the public would be less likely to believe in the existence of UFOs, thereby reducing the risk of widespread panic. Second, Blue Curtain was instructed to classify its most sensitive findings as top secret, ensuring that only a select group of officials had access to the information. Reports that suggested an extraterrestrial origin for the objects were particularly sensitive and were often destroyed or altered to remove any suggestion that the objects were anything other than earthly in origin. This policy of secrecy extended even to members of the unit itself, with investigators often kept in the dark about the full scope of their work. Third, the Soviet government sought to suppress information about UFOs not only within its own borders, but also in its satellite states in Eastern Europe. Reports of sightings in countries such as East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia were heavily censored, and local authorities were instructed to follow the Soviet lead in downplaying the significance of the phenomenon. This was done in part to prevent the spread of information that could undermine the Soviet Union's control over its satellite states, but also to prevent the possibility of a broader international crisis. The campaign of disinformation and secrecy was highly effective, and for decades the Soviet public remained largely unaware of the extent of the government's investigations into UFOs. Those who did report sightings often found themselves ostracized or ridiculed, and the few who persisted in their claims were sometimes subjected to more severe measures, including threats of imprisonment or worse. the fall of the Soviet Union and the unraveling of the secret. For decades, the Soviet Union managed to keep the existence of Blue Curtain and its investigations a secret. But as the 1980s drew to a close, the Soviet Union itself began to unravel. Economic stagnation, political unrest, and the pressures of the Cold War all contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet state. And with it, the walls of secrecy that had protected its darkest secrets began to crumble. As the Soviet Union dissolved, many former government officials and military personnel began to speak out about their experiences, and stories about the secret UFO investigation unit began to surface. Some former members of Blue Curtain came forward with their accounts describing the unit's work in detail and revealing the extent of the Soviet government's efforts to keep the truth hidden. These revelations sparked a renewed interest in the Soviet Union's UFO investigations, both in Russia and in the West. Researchers and journalists began to dig into the newly available archives, uncovering documents that provided further evidence of the Soviet government's secretive approach to the UFO phenomenon. But despite these revelations, much of what Blue Curtain uncovered remains shrouded in mystery. Many of the unit's most sensitive documents were destroyed in the final days of the Soviet Union, and some former members of the unit have refused to speak publicly about their work. One of the most significant revelations came from a former KGB officer who claimed that Blue Curtain had uncovered evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, but that the Soviet government had chosen to suppress the information for fear of provoking a global crisis. According to this source, Blue Curtain had investigated several incidents in which UFOs had allegedly crashed and had recovered materials that were of non-terrestrial origin. These materials, which were reportedly analyzed in secret laboratories, were said to exhibit properties that defied known science. The legacy of Blue Curtain. The story of Blue Curtain is a testament to the lengths that governments will go to in order to protect their secrets. For decades, the Soviet Union managed to keep the existence of its UFO investigation unit hidden from the world. And even today, much of what the unit uncovered remains unknown. But the legacy of Blue Curtain goes beyond the secrets it kept. It is also a reminder of the profound impact that the UFO phenomenon had on the Cold War era, a time when the fear of the unknown drove nations to take extraordinary measures to protect themselves. The secrecy surrounding Blue Curtain also raises important questions about the relationship between governments and the public. The Soviet Union's decision to keep its investigations secret was motivated by a desire to maintain control and prevent public panic, but it also deprived the public of information that could have shaped their understanding of the world. The decision to suppress information about UFOs was not unique to the Soviet Union. Similar decisions were made by governments around the world, including in the United States. But the case of Blue Curtain is a particularly stark example of the lengths that a government will go to in order to maintain its grip on power. Today, the legacy of Blue Curtain lives on in the continued interest in UFOs and the search for the truth about what the Soviet Union uncovered. As more documents are declassified and more former officials come forward, we may one day learn the full story of what Blue Curtain discovered and what it means for our understanding of the UFO phenomenon. But until then, the story of Blue Curtain remains one of the great mysteries of the Cold War, an enigma hidden behind the iron curtain of secrecy that defined an era. Conclusion: the quest for truth. The story of how the Soviet Union hid a secret UFO investigation unit is not just a tale of Cold War intrigue. It is also a story about the quest for truth in a world where governments often go to great lengths to keep secrets hidden. The existence of Blue Curtain and the Soviet government's efforts to suppress information about UFOs raise important questions about the nature of power, secrecy, and the public's right to know. In the years since the fall of the Soviet Union, the truth about Blue Curtain has slowly begun to emerge, but many questions remain unanswered. What did the Soviet Union really know about UFOs? Were these objects advanced American aircraft, as some within the government suspected, or were they evidence of extraterrestrial visitors? And what, if anything, did the Soviet government learn from its investigations? These are questions that continue to captivate researchers and enthusiasts alike, and as more information comes to light, the answers may finally be within reach. But whatever the truth may be, the story of Blue Curtain is a reminder that even in the most secretive of societies, the quest for knowledge and understanding cannot be suppressed forever. The truth, as they say, is out there, and it is only a matter of time before it comes to light.